men are more oppressed than women.
For sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And in fact, and not only today, but historically too.
In some ways, sure. Like if you want to talk about like
men
male
are scared to even
disposability-
speak to women.
If you want to talk about male
Women are scared to
disposability,
speak to
men
men.
No,
having
does that
like
have to do with
climbing rates of
anything?
like suicide, I'm gonna be with you.
What percentage
On
of
those, I won't even disagree with you.
what percentage of people that are homeless are men?
Probably the majority, no?
3 and 4.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Where does the
negative
matriarchy fit
outcomes.
into that oppression? Is that like?
Well, that's a really simple one. How long do you think a homeless woman would make it?
I think
She's
that
more likely
women,
to get
I agree
into,
with you, but I think a lot of women will rather
trafficking?
go end up on their
No.
back than end up on the streets.
That would rather what?
Women
End up
are
on their
more,
back than end up on the streets.
Sure, but
Who do you
I
think
mean,
is,
like
like,
even
in a
even
more
ignoring
vulnerable
well,
place?
even ignoring that, I'm just saying that like there's a lot of questions that we ask in terms of like, and the oppression Olympics thing is weird. To be clear, because I'm drawing my own, so patriarchy arguably oppresses and raises up both men and women in different ways, right? But when we ask questions like, well, who's more homeless? Men can survive being homeless because we have a lot of biological advantages and because we're not subject to violence from other men in the same types of ways that women are, right?
Right.
For instance, when women talk about, or when red pillars say, you need a man to protect you from who? From other men, right? Because that's typically the people that are abusing or violating other women. So
Fair
when you ask
play.
that question, who's more likely to be homeless? It's probably going to be men, of course. It's like 98%. But
So-
women are going to make it homeless.
Fair point, but I want to add on to that because
Sure.
she's saying that the patriarchy, disproportionately affects women in a negative way, and it doesn't affect men in a negative way. But then where does homelessness come into play?
So the reason why I don't like to use negative is because patriarchy is just like
I don't go based off of her example.
Sure,
That's what I'm saying.
I understand. Patriarchy is like a way that society is structured. It's enforced by everybody because in some ways men and women benefit from it. In some ways men and women hurt from it. But there are the way that we suffer under it, arguably, is subjective in whether or not it's good or bad. So for instance, like I imagine on this side of the table, people would say that women being relegated to relatively narrow roles and how they could participate in the house and society, they consider that a good thing. Feminists traditionally would say, well, women being relegated to narrow roles in the house would be a bad thing, right? So it's hard to say that like, is patriarchy good or bad? It's just like a form of organizing a society, the same way that a matriarchy would be, the same way egalitarian would be. There's gonna be pros and cons to every type of organization, right? Even patriarchy in some ways is incredibly beneficial to how society is arranged. It makes like figuring out gender roles and households and everything incredibly fucking simple. And it gives really clear guidelines for how men are supposed to act and how women are supposed to act. That's like a benefit.
For sure.
But in some ways it's a negative.
Destiny
and
arguing for patriarchy right
but
now?
in some
Let's
ways
go.
it's a negative because you might have an incredibly talented pool of women that could be contributing to society in really positive ways that are now basically relegated to being barefoot and pregnant in their homes all the time because we don't really want their contributions, right? The reason why I think that our society has succeeded more in the West than it did in any other place in the world is to some extent because we opened the floodgates to allow any type of person to have a conversation. And that's why podcasts like this or Fresh and Fit, you're getting people from that have traveled to Saudi Arabia and Dubai coming back and arguing with black women and Hispanic women and men of all sorts of different backgrounds and religions are all coming together having these conversations. They're not doing that in Saudi Arabia. They're not doing that in Iran. They're not even doing that in a lot of places in Europe. That's happening in the United States of America. And I think it's largely because we've tried to break down a lot of those barriers.
Are you contributing the success of the West to the principle of free speech?
I think
Largely?
that for freedom of speech and for unlocking the talent pool that you have of people by not hardcore relegating them to certain roles.
The reason why I ask is because the West was successful relative to other civilizations long before we had free speech and equal rights for everybody.
I mean, the United States was kind of founded on pretty radical principles of free speech and democracy and democratic
representation.
representation,
Yes, it was,
right?
but the West existed prior to the United States, and I'm
talking about the real West, okay? The U.S. Europe, okay.
I mean, if we're talking
But
about
I'm just saying,
the real West, it's the
that,
West
like,
Coast, bro.
For even the people who all love to like love and hate, like people like Elon Musk, this guy came from like South Africa, right? Like there's so much cool shit that happens in the U.S. that only happens in the U.S.
Yeah, I
because
agree.
people come here, and I know
agree.
you guys have argued people come here for the opportunity and stuff. We have a really unique environment here, and I think largely it's because we've tried to push people outside of like the hardcore relegated roles that we feel like they need to be in, which I think benefits all of us.
America.
Yeah.
I do have to interrupt.